The world held its breath, then collectively gasped as the news flashed across every screen, every channel, every digital feed. Breaking: US and Israel just launch major attack as Iran enters critical phase. The words, stark and terrifying, painted a picture of an immediate, large-scale military operation, a calculated blow in a long simmering conflict that had now reached an unprecedented level of intensity. It was not a slow burn, not a gradual increase in tensions, but a sudden, thunderous assault that ripped through the fragile fabric of regional stability, sending shockwaves far beyond the ancient lands of the Middle East. The initial reports were fragmented, chaotic, yet undeniably clear. Coordinated military operations, launched with overwhelming force and surgical precision, had targeted key Iranian nuclear facilities, military bases, and command and control centers. The skies over Tehran, Isfahan, and Bandar Abbas, usually bustling with civilian air traffic, were now ablaze with the contrails of advanced fighter jets, the fiery ascent of interceptor missiles, and the devastating impact of precision-guided munitions. Sirens wailed, piercing the night, a chilling soundtrack to the unfolding catastrophe, signaling that Iran had indeed entered a critical, perhaps existential phase. For decades, the geopolitical chessboard of the Middle East had been defined by a delicate, often precarious balance of power. Iran, with its ambitious nuclear program and its network of proxy forces stretching from Lebanon to Yemen, had long been viewed as a destabilizing force by both the United States and Israel. The rhetoric had been sharp, the threats thinly veiled, the shadowboxing constant. Yet, a full-scale military confrontation had always been the unthinkable, the red line that cooler heads, however reluctantly, had managed to avoid crossing. Until now. The decision to launch such an audacious, high-stakes attack was not made lightly. Behind the scenes, in the hushed situation rooms and secure bunkers, intelligence assessments had likely reached a critical mass, indicating an imminent threat that could no longer be contained through diplomacy or sanctions. Perhaps it was a breakthrough in Iran's nuclear enrichment capabilities, a perceived acceleration towards a weaponized state that left no room for further delay. Perhaps it was a direct, undeniable link to a planned terrorist attack of catastrophic proportions, or an aggressive move against vital shipping lanes that threatened global commerce. Whatever the immediate trigger, the scale of this attack indicated a profound shift in strategy, a determination to fundamentally alter the regional power dynamics. The die was cast, and the consequences were instantaneous and devastating. The first wave of attacks, reportedly spearheaded by Israeli F-35s and supported by US stealth bombers, was designed to be overwhelming. Its primary objective was to neutralize Iran's extensive air defenses, which had been bolstered by Russian and Chinese systems, and to cripple its nuclear infrastructure with an intensity never before witnessed. Explosions rocked the Natanz and Fordow enrichment sites, sending massive plumes of smoke into the pre-dawn sky, visible for miles. Simultaneously, hundreds of cruise missiles, launched from US naval assets in the Persian Gulf and the Mediterranean, struck Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps (IRGC) bases, missile silos, and strategic command and control centers across the country. The objective was clear: to degrade Iran's ability to retaliate effectively and to set back its nuclear program by years, if not decades, pushing it back from the brink of nuclear capability. But even the most sophisticated military planning cannot account for the unpredictable nature of war, especially in a region as volatile as the Middle East, and the sheer scale of this assault guaranteed an equally monumental response. Within hours of the initial strikes, the world watched with bated breath for Iran's response. It came swiftly, not in the form of immediate, widespread military retaliation, but in a series of fiery pronouncements from Tehran, signaling that the nation had entered a critical phase of decision and defiance. Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, in a rare public address, condemned the attacks as an act of unprovoked aggression and vowed a crushing and decisive response that would make the aggressors regret their actions. His words, usually measured, now carried an unprecedented weight of fury and determination. President Ibrahim Raisi echoed these sentiments, declaring that the era of hit and run was over and that Iran would respond proportionally and decisively to any act of aggression, implying a direct and forceful counterattack. The head of the IRGC, Major General Hossein Salami, went further, stating that Iran's response would be painful and unforgettable and would target the very sources of the aggression, explicitly mentioning US and Israeli interests. These were not mere rhetorical flourishes. They were clear, unambiguous threats, signaling that Iran would not absorb these major strikes without a significant, perhaps even existential, countermove. The world braced for impact, understanding that the initial attacks were merely the opening salvo in what promised to be a far more extensive and dangerous conflict, with Iran now at a crossroads. Tehran's vow of retaliation was not an empty threat. Intelligence agencies across the globe immediately began to track Iranian military movements, anticipating the nature and scale of their response. Would it be a direct military confrontation, targeting US or Israeli assets with its arsenal of ballistic missiles? Would it involve a massive surge in proxy attacks through Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in Gaza, or the Houthi rebels in Yemen, igniting multiple fronts simultaneously? Or would Iran unleash its formidable cyber warfare capabilities, crippling critical infrastructure in the West and beyond? The uncertainty itself was a potent weapon, sowing fear and disrupting global markets. Shipping in the Strait of Hormuz, a critical choke point for global oil supplies, was immediately halted, sending oil prices soaring to unprecedented levels, triggering panic in financial markets worldwide. Global stock markets plunged, reflecting the widespread panic and the grim realization that a major regional conflict could trigger a worldwide economic recession of historic proportions. Within hours, the retaliatory strikes began, confirming the fears of many. Iran, despite the initial damage, unleashed a barrage of ballistic missiles and drones towards Israel and US military installations across the region. Tel Aviv and Jerusalem were plunged into darkness as air raid sirens blared, followed by the thud of Iron Dome interceptors and the distant rumble of explosions, some of which reportedly breached defenses. US bases in Iraq, Syria, and the UAE came under heavy fire, forcing personnel into bunkers and triggering emergency response protocols, with reports of significant damage and casualties emerging. The Strait of Hormuz, a critical choke point for global oil supplies, became a full-blown war zone. Iranian naval forces, including fast attack crafts and submarines, engaged US and allied warships, threatening to disrupt the flow of oil and send global energy markets into a tailspin. Oil prices surged to unprecedented levels, triggering panic in financial markets worldwide. The global economy, already grappling with inflation and supply chain issues, teetered on the brink of collapse as the critical phase of Iran's response unfolded. The humanitarian crisis was immediate and profound. Millions of civilians caught in the crossfire of this major attack and subsequent retaliation fled their homes, seeking refuge in neighboring countries or desperately trying to reach safer zones within Iran. Refugee camps, already strained by previous conflicts, were overwhelmed by the sheer volume of displaced persons. Hospitals struggled to cope with the influx of casualties, their resources stretched thin, their medical supplies dwindling rapidly. The internet and communication networks in Iran were severely disrupted, plunging vast swaths of the country into an information blackout, making it impossible to ascertain the true extent of the damage or the human cost. International aid organizations issued urgent appeals, but the escalating conflict made it incredibly difficult to deliver assistance to those most in need, as the region descended further into chaos. Global reactions were swift and sharply divided. Allies of the United States and Israel, while expressing concern, largely stood by their partners, reiterating their commitment to regional security and condemning Iran's alleged provocations that led to the major attack. European nations, caught between their transatlantic alliances and their economic ties to the Middle East, called for de-escalation and a return to diplomacy, their pleas sounding increasingly hollow against the backdrop of exploding missiles and collapsing markets. Russia and China, long-standing rivals of the US, vehemently condemned the attacks, accusing Washington and Tel Aviv of violating international law and deliberately destabilizing the region. They called for an emergency session of the UN Security Council, threatening to veto any resolution that did not explicitly condemn the US and Israeli actions. The diplomatic channels, already strained, were now on the verge of complete breakdown, as the world grappled with the implications of this new, critical phase in the Middle East. Within the United States, the attack ignited a firestorm of debate. Supporters hailed it as a decisive act of self-defense, a necessary measure to prevent Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons and to protect American interests, arguing that Iran's entry into a critical phase of nuclear development necessitated such a response. Critics, however, decried it as a reckless act of aggression, warning of a protracted and costly war that would inevitably draw the U.S. deeper into the quagmire of the Middle East, with no clear exit strategy. Protests erupted in major cities, with anti-war activists clashing with police, demanding an immediate end to hostilities. The political landscape, already polarized, became even more fractured, with the upcoming elections now overshadowed by the specter of a full-blown regional war. In Israel, the mood was a mixture of defiance and apprehension. While the government maintained that the attacks were a preemptive measure to safeguard national security against an Iran entering a critical phase, the constant threat of Iranian retaliation cast a pall over daily life. Citizens huddled in bomb shelters, their lives disrupted by the incessant wail of sirens and the fear of what the next hour, the next day, might bring. The long-standing conflict with Palestine, temporarily eclipsed by the larger regional conflagration, threatened to reignite, adding another layer of complexity to an already intractable situation, further complicating Israel's security calculus. The broader Middle East was plunged into unprecedented chaos. Proxy wars, which had simmered for years, now threatened to explode into full-blown regional conflicts. Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in Gaza, and Houthi rebels in Yemen, all backed by Iran, launched coordinated attacks against Israel and Saudi Arabia, further widening the scope of the conflict. Saudi Arabia and the UAE, long wary of Iran's ambitions, found themselves directly in the line of fire, their oil infrastructure and major cities becoming targets. The delicate alliances and rivalries that had characterized the region for so long were now being violently reshaped, with unpredictable and potentially catastrophic consequences as Iran's critical phase rippled across the entire region. The global implications were equally dire. The disruption of oil supplies threatened to trigger a worldwide recession, impacting every nation, rich or poor. Trade routes were imperiled, supply chains fractured, and the cost of living soared. Cyber attacks, launched by state-sponsored actors and independent hacker groups, targeted critical infrastructure in the US, Europe, and Asia, adding another dimension to the unfolding chaos. The threat of nuclear proliferation, already a major concern, intensified as nations watched the events unfold, questioning the efficacy of international treaties and the wisdom of relying on diplomatic solutions. The specter of a wider conflict, drawing in other global powers, loomed large, raising fears of a third world war, a direct consequence of the major attack and Iran's entry into this critical phase. As the dust settled on the initial hours of the conflict, it became clear that the Middle East had entered a new, terrifying chapter. The carefully constructed deterrents, the unspoken rules of engagement, had been shattered. The region, already a crucible of conflict and instability, was now a full-blown inferno, its flames threatening to engulf the entire world. The decision to launch a major attack on Iran, however justified it may have been in the eyes of its architects, had unleashed a cascade of events that would redefine global geopolitics for generations to come. The immediate future was uncertain, fraught with danger, and dominated by the chilling reality that the chaos had only just begun, and Iran's critical phase was far from over. The world watched, helpless and horrified, as the Middle East erupted, its fate, and perhaps the fate of the world, hanging precariously in the balance. The major attack on Iran was not merely a military operation. It was a seismic event, a rupture in the global order that would reverberate for years, leaving behind a legacy of destruction, displacement, and an enduring sense of dread. The hope for peace, once a distant possibility, now seemed an impossible dream, swallowed by the escalating violence and the relentless march towards an unknown, terrifying future. The initial reports, once shocking, now seemed to be merely the opening salvo in a conflict whose true scale and consequences were yet to be fully comprehended. The Middle East, a region steeped in history and conflict, had once again become the epicenter of global turmoil, its chaos a stark reminder of the fragility of peace and the devastating cost of war. Iran's entry into this critical phase meant that the stakes were higher than ever, and the path forward was fraught with peril, promising further escalation and an uncertain future for all involved.